Hi, I'm Eric with Smart Pot Fabric Planners, back with a special follow-up episode of the Growing Revolution. And in one of our first episodes, we interviewed Milo Shammas, the president and founder of Dr. Earth, where we touched upon the subject of chicken manure and its role in the fertilizer industry. Now, that came out in about January, February or so, but in the spring of this year, we saw in the news many chicken farms detecting avian flu at their facilities. And what's crazy is just one positive test triggers the instant slaughter of millions of chickens at a time using methods that many would consider to be inhumane. And it got me thinking about chickens again and why this was happening in the first place. And I started to do a little bit more research on the industry, and my findings were confusing and maybe a little bit shocking. And I would say in life, you are what you eat, and what you eat is what you excrete. Now, is what we are feeding to chickens okay, and does that have consequences down the line? So I reached back out to Milo with my concerns, and we decided that this was a topic worth expanding on, and we wanted to get him back on the program and into the studio as an expert on fertilizers in general, and especially organic fertilizers. The main topic that I wanted to cover is, are all organic fertilizers good, and are there components of organic fertilizers that shouldn't be in there? So, Milo, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eric. Good to be here.
Yes. It's been a while. So, like I said, there's been, more chicken tragedies in the news. But, before kind of diving into that, I wanted to verify some industry statistics with you, if that was okay. I found that the poultry industry is valued at around $40 billion annually. Wow. Does that seem accurate?
Yeah, I mean, I remember the last time I looked, it's been a couple of years, it was in like the 34 billion range, so that wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, that's a big industry. Probably a lot of people are shocked, but I mean, think about how much chicken you consume in a weekly basis, and it makes sense.
Sure.
And diving into the numbers further, I found that around 98% of chickens are raised in these confined factory farms. So basically, almost the entire 40 billion industry comes from these farms. Makes sense, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that's an indisputable fact. That's very accurate, in my opinion, for sure.
Yeah, makes sense. And then, so you got to feed these chickens, and 90% of all corn and soy that we grow in the United States is coming from GMO seeds, which allows them to tolerate the glyphosate herbicides that farmers are using for weed control. So, I think it's pretty safe to say that the vast majority, if not all, of the food that we're feeding to these chickens is GMO derived, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's been my understanding for years. It's that's where these grains. I mean, I didn't realize that. So it's up to 90% as of today. I mean, I know you gave me some statistics to look at. Was that in there? 90%.
Yeah, that and from other stats I've seen, it's pretty rare that farmers are not using, Monsanto or Bayer derived seeds, just for the reasons of, that we stated for weed control, and it makes sense. It's economics, unfortunately. So from those stats, I found that around 700 million tons of mostly GMO feed is used to feed these chickens. And in the course of raising these chickens, they're producing around 335 million tons of manure. And I have to imagine that's dry weight manure, not wet manure. Do these numbers make sense?
Yeah, I mean, if you said 7, and I did have a chance to study those numbers, I recall them. I mean, if you say 700 million in, and then you said 335 million tons out in dry weight. Yeah, that seems statistically correct because from my understanding, and, I've studied the poultry industry, Eric, obviously, for a long time. That's why you have me on the show. But it takes 4.2 kilograms of feed to produce 2.4 pounds of protein, of chicken protein. So when you tell me 700 million tons went in and 335 million tons came out in the very end, that seems statistically accurate to me because the rest would be in the bird weight, the protein. So there seems to be balance in your mathematics here.
Okay. So it sounds like the FDA and the USDA have a huge incentive to dispose of manure from these factory farms in the most economical manner because obviously we can't just allow these byproducts to go directly into the waterways. So what's happening with all this animal waste?
Well, I mean, that's always been kind of one of the obstacles I've always faced in that the existing, bureaucrats, they're obligated. I mean, they're elected to kind of deal with, one of the things they have to deal with is like all this waste that, that society produces and society needs like meats and vegetables and other things like that. So, I mean, they have to facilitate the ability of these farmers and to raise chickens in intense areas, but then at the same time you have to feed people the chicken protein like you would with the beef protein in a beef farm or pork, so on and so forth. The common sense part of it, you have to deal with the waste. Same thing with with fish farming, same exact thing. You have to deal with the fish waste. In that case, people don't seem to have such a big problem with it because fish waste is looked at very differently than land animal waste. But yeah, I mean, the bureaucrats, they have a problem. And their problem is called waste to keep society moving. So, I mean, they have to somehow work with these chicken farmers to facilitate avenues to be able to remove the chicken waste. I mean, and I know it's massive amounts. I mean, you gave me a really funny analogy, which was like, you said, 400 football fields stacked 100 feet high to get rid of 335, million tons. I mean, God, can you imagine if that was released into the Pacific Ocean, just like that? You'd probably shut down the beaches from Mexico to Canada. I would probably be the biggest, catastrophe in modern time. So, I mean, yes, they have challenges, Eric, and it's a big deal. This waste is a really big problem. So they have to facilitate ways to move it out. And this is one of the ways that they do it is fertilizers and manures and, land management and, things of that nature.
Yeah. What really kind of shocked me is, did you know that the manure coming from these factory chicken farms can be considered an organic input material according to the USDA? GMO manure is certainly being applied to countless organic certified farms, right?
Yeah, and yes, it is, and I have a huge issue with that. And when you interviewed me, in last year, I brought it up, and it is a big deal. I don't think it's right because chicken manures. I mean, you clearly spelled out the mathematics behind that. They're coming from factory farms. I mean, 98%, over 98%, you validated is coming from factory farms. So that means the probabilities of it getting that, 90% of all grains, being GMO, those chickens being fed that is more than likely, more than probable. So, to take that manure, which we can say, all manures that are packaged for mass production. I mean, if you have a fertilizer and you're selling to Home Depot, Lowe's, Walmart, or any of the really legitimate national chains, you've got to have a real supply, capability. You can't just go down to the local chicken farmer, Johnny's family chicken farm, which they do exist, by the way. And I've always loved chicken farmers for that respect. I mean, I love chickens. I raise chickens personally. I love them, and I love their manure. But that's totally different than what you're talking about. What you're talking about is a factory chicken that's being fed GMO grains, and you and I both know 100% of that manure contains GMOs because what goes in must come out. It's not like 700 million tons go in and they magically become converted and somehow through a magic box and the GMOs get wiped out. It doesn't work like that. If anything, they're probably concentrated. I mean, that was, my research from years ago. I thought that was, crazy. So, yeah, I mean, I still can't believe that they allow it in organic agriculture. I don't think it has a place for that. I do believe that the bureaucrats need to move the manure out. You can't just simply say, well, we're going to create the waste. We have to feed society, but we're not going to allow you to do anything with it. That isn't right either. I'm simply saying,
Right.
I'm observing what you said is a big deal that organic farmers and even, homegrown gardeners, guys growing a vegetable patch, have no idea because you're right. It does say certified organic on it, but they have no idea they're bringing in the GMOs as you pointed out the super obvious. I mean, it's like, wow.
Yeah, it almost seems like an elephant in the room that nobody sees. I'm just trying to wrap my head around this. I mean, we know that GMO products directly cannot be labeled as organic just by on its face. I don't get how GMO byproducts that are obviously GMO byproducts from chicken manure can then be classified as an organic fertilizer.
You know what I think?
And yeah, it's a higher concentration. It seems like almost like a controversy is brewing here.
Yeah, I mean, it really smells like that. I mean, that's why I was so glad when you got a hold of me and told me about this, is because I think, Eric, what I really believe it is? I think you just said it a minute ago. I think the food labels, I mean, if you and I are going to consume like a biscuit or a cracker, let's say, or something like that, and we know it comes from a GMO grain, I think it has to be labeled. I think it's different. I think when you deal about, with manures, even though they're regulated by the same body or like, the same federal entity, United States Department of Agriculture. But remember, there's multiple divisions, and the people that police the food labels and the people that police the fertilizer labels are totally different, and they have different sets of standards and bylaws that they have to abide by. So, I mean, I think that's it. I think the fact that it's going into a manure, I think they're looking at, okay, well, what's the nitrogen content? What's the pH? What's the acidity of it? Does it contain heavy metals? Or really where they look for chicken problems, in my opinion, Eric, is they usually look for E. coli and salmonella. They don't, they don't go in there and say, well, let's look for genetically modified organisms. Even though, I mean, we know, and you pointed out, you're right, it's like it's hiding in plain sight. 700 million tons of plain sight. It's going in. We all know it's going out. I just don't think they're proactively looking for this in that type of industry, Eric. That's what I really believe it is. I don't think that they're being malicious about it or they're trying to hide something. I just don't think anybody's ever identified it the way you did. I don't think it's just ever been done before. I mean, I think this is, revolutionary. It's like, it's so darn obvious.
Or if they have identified it, it's maybe a big can of worms that they just don't even want to crack open because it could have some ramifications down the line. So I had a general kind of stepping back, question for you. If you could break down, what is an organic fertilizer versus a non-organic fertilizer?
I mean, I think the way that the Wikipedia gives it to you is if it's carbon-based, it's technically organic. Now, whether it's a contaminated organic, that's a different animal. So, I mean, we can say, hey, was it natural or is it organic? Technically, if it contains a carbon element, it's organic. If it's, let's say, if it's some mine mineral like sand or clay or something like that, that's natural. There's nothing bad about it, but it just can't be organic because it lacks the carbon. That's the literal definition of organic. But I think people are more concerned with, well, what's good and what's bad. And I think that's a different question. Let's say for a crop, an organic crop, which is just carbon-based soy, for example, not genetically modified. Let's say if it's an old variety that came out of Japan, 50 years ago. And let's say if that crop was growing and it was certified organic because technically it's carbon-based. No one's put anything on it. But let's just say somebody takes something like a chemical, a man-made chemical synthetic compound that are commonly made in today's agriculture to control insects and pests and fungal diseases. Let's say if that synthetic chemical was applied to that plant, that carbon-based plant, then you and I would be concerned about it. And then it wouldn't be able to achieve, let's say, a CCOF status, certified California certified organic farmer status, and it wouldn't be certified as an organic produce. I think that's a more relevant question. And I think when USDA and those folks look at a manure, I think they're looking at it through pretty, as a matter of fact, lenses. I don't think their scope is like this, like you and I are looking at it, saying, hold on a second. Hey, 700 tons had to come from someplace, and they had to go somewhere. We know what you're looking for, and that's okay, though, because maybe that's all you've ever, supposed to have been supposed to look for. And maybe now we're just simply saying maybe it should be looked at differently because, it's a big deal. It's a huge deal. Because, and I'm in the industry, Eric. This is what I do for a living. Shame on me for not being the one to identify this, but this is what I do for a living. And, I didn't think about the most obvious thing. It's like, yes, it has the organic certified status, but I don't think gardeners know that it's, when they bring that home, that it's actually going to the soil that they're directly putting their plant roots into. And the way chicken manure works. I've never been a fan of this ingredient, commercially raised, conventionally produced, I should say. It's kind of like it's like a slurry. If you were to make a tea out of chicken manure, it really it distributes in the soil profile very quickly. It's not like a mealy ingredient that's, let's say, like an alfalfa meal or a feather meal or something a physical particle that can't travel when it's watered. The manure takes on like a slurry, like a soupy type of a medium. And therefore, when you apply that to, let's say, a base of a plant, let's say, or a base of a tree, and you broadcast it, there's a very good chance that when you water it down, and especially, with a showering wand like most of us use, it's going to equally distribute that slurry. And you're going to basically influence and alter that entire soil profile. And that's going to leach down into the entire root zone. So the whole rhizosphere technically could be influenced by your addition of that organic fertilizer in the manure in the form that it's coming in. And that is a big deal. That's a huge deal.
Well, and then beyond the rhizosphere, below that is our water table. So, I have to assume some compounds are making their way into there. And, the science, I guess, is still out. Is GMO, bad for us? Is it neutral? I've heard conflicting reports. So, but I think, knowledge is power. And I think a lot of consumers of compost and fertilizer products would like to know, where those ingredients are coming from. Because it sounds like, not all organic is necessarily created equal.
For sure.
So digging in further into the National Organic Program, I found a stat that said a product can still have an organic certification as long as 70% of the ingredients are organically sourced, and the remaining 30% comes from a list of allowed inorganic sources. So I'd be willing to bet that the majority of organic product consumers don't know this fact. What's your take on it?
Well, my take on it is we have to live in a society. Unfortunately, the genie's been let out already, Eric, and I think that the regulators are just doing the best they can, trying to be as honest as they can, as transparent, I think that's a better word, as they can. The modern world's already contaminated with GMO. It's been genetically altered. We can find GMO residues on some remote islands where no one lives on, but some plant tissues have been tested and have been altered. So it's there. Now, whether you farm it, produce it, choose to ingest it on a regular basis, throughout the year, 3 meals a day, that's a different thing. I think that's what you're saying. It's like, so I think, the regulators have to, allow farmers to produce and ranchers to ranch and, people to make and sell stuff to keep the economy in the world going. I think that's the answer to that. I know it's a really long-winded one and it's not direct, but it's like that's the only way I can answer it. I mean, back to your chicken question. I mean, 700, would you say, $40 billion of chicken products. I mean, I'm not free of sin either, Eric. I mean, I'm not a vegetarian, and I do eat chicken. It's not like I live in a bottle or like, vacuum. I have to go through a drive-through with my family more often than less often. I travel for my company. I have to eat at airport restaurants. I mean, I don't think those guys have like another chicken supplier source that isn't going through a factory farm. I mean, I'm guilty of it, and I suspect you are too. We're just here to say, do gardeners know that their manures contain GMOs? I think that's really the crux of it, right? I mean, that's a big deal. Forget about. I mean, I think if they knew, it might change their thinking. I mean,
Yep.
I think the stomach is a strange thing. I don't think that when you and I eat like GMO protein, that's the reason why these guys are still able to farm it and use it, because no one's been able to scientifically prove that you and I can somehow extract this changed molecular protein, and somehow absorb it and it alter our bodies and change us and grow a third eye. You remember they used to say, hey, you're going to grow a third eye if you eat GMOs. Well, clearly no one's grown a third eye. If anything, GMOs have grown livers and kidneys and, kept people alive. So it's been a different thing. I mean, no one can prove that the stomach is absorbing these GMOs separately from the proteins, the fats, the carbohydrates. I've always known that. And that's the reason why I intentionally, when I started my company years and years ago, I knew not to use manures. I'm not a big fan of manures because I understand the way the stomach works, and I have since I was a very young man. By the time you rinse everything, through your stomach, you've taken all the good stuff out of it. The stuff that comes out is usually bad. That's why, steer manure, even 30 years ago wasn't a great ingredient. Chicken manure 50 years ago, I think was a great ingredient because it was in factory farms and genetically modified organisms weren't yet mass produced and, part of our everyday life. I think that's a big part of the whole story. Yeah, but there's a lot of moving parts. It's a really complex. It's a really complex problem. It is.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of sounds like as long as we're going to have livestock farms, they're going to continue to produce a massive amount of waste, and that waste has to go somewhere besides directly into the waterways. So, is applying chicken and other animal manures directly to, fields the only way to deal with it, or is it just the most economical way for big ag?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the $40 billion question, right? I think, it's one thing for the regulators, for government, both local, state, or even federal government to deal with waste that we as human beings produce, whether it's poultry waste or sheep waste or whatever waste it is, bovine waste. We have to deal with it, and that's just the way it is. But I think there's two different ways to deal with it. I think you have to move it to big ag. You have to. You can't just let it sit in these football fields and pile up for the next 2 centuries. That you can't. That's not waste management. I think you have to apply that to areas that are maybe people don't consume the vegetables or the fruits that come out of that land. Maybe it's just land that needs to be fertilized. Maybe that's the way it's dealt with. And I'm sure, and I'm positive, there's millions of acres available for that type of land treatment. I think when you talk about a home gardener, a guy like you and I that would own, a normal home, our lot is 50 feet wide by 150 feet deep. I'm just going to pretend like, that's the lot I remember as a kid growing up in Los Angeles. That's what you own. But you've never really had GMO problems. You heard about it from the supermarket and, other places like that. You've never really brought it home and introduced it into that 50 by 150 plot that you own. And that's all you own. So I think for those guys, I think there's a different like ethical component, from what you're bringing up, because if those homeowners are unknowingly bringing GMOs home and applying it to their land and changing the structure of that land, or not the structure, but the elements, how that land could potentially behave. Now, it may not be bad, Eric. It really may not be. So what? So you're saying, well, what's the big deal? You brought some GMOs home that went through the stomach of some poultry. Big deal. Is the world going to blow up? No, it's probably not. But wouldn't it be nice if you told me? That would be my answer to that, right?
Honesty is the best policy. That's what my parents taught me. So, just kind of wrapping things up, how can we as home gardeners, avoid GMO contamination? In the short answer is, it sounds like stay away from manure-based fertilizer products, because it's more than likely they're going to be contaminated.
Absolutely.
Right?
I think it's that. I think it's staying away from steer manure. I mean, we didn't talk about that but because I don't think so few people even use it anymore. But yeah, to stay away from the manures. I mean, no one's selling pork manure. Very little sheep manure out there. I mean, it's like, also, we didn't even talk about this. It's not just the organic fertilizer guys that are guilty of selling manures and, potentially contaminating people's land with the GMOs. It's there's soil manufacturers out there. There's a lot of guys that's how they enrich their soil blends, their potting soils or planting mixes. And it's an array of manufacturers, So they use chicken manure as the fertilizing agent when they're selling organically. Ironically enough, it's coming from the organic community, my community. We're the guys that are actually polluting people's homes and people's land through certified organic soils and fertilizers. And that's, I'm almost ashamed of that, because it's like, it shouldn't be coming from us. You'd think it would be some evil, evil corporate thing that Monsanto was doing. It's not. They've actually been the most honest about this. They produce, GMO seeds. They tell you what they're doing. They produce, the glyphosate that addresses their GMOs. I mean, they're actually the most honest. It's the guys in the organic community saying, hey, this is great. Don't worry about it. It's certified organic. And yeah, I mean, I think that is a big deal. I mean, I think, that's I believe that's when you got, me listening to you, because I believe that's the code right there. That's a big deal. That is a huge deal.
Yeah. I think knowledge is power, and hopefully this discussion between us hopefully blossoms into more conversations between people in our industry, people who are in the regulatory agencies, to rectify what I think is a wrong here. Consumers should know exactly what they're putting onto their land and feeding to their plants. And if something is obviously not organic, but we're saying that it is, to me, that's
Absolutely.
an issue.
I couldn't agree more. Yes.
Well, I think we kind of got to the bottom of things here, and I think we just hopefully raised everybody's knowledge level on organics and what's going into organic fertilizers. And yes, I hope this spurs more conversations and hopefully some action.
I'm really glad you did this, Eric, and thank you for having me. I think it's one of the best, subjects to talk about that I've heard in decades, to be honest with you. It's the obvious in the room that no one's talking about. So thank you for, inviting me and for making this a subject that people should be talking about, because it is a big deal, especially in the organic gardening community. It's a huge deal.
Yeah. I know I'm going to be doing some more research down the line, hopefully getting into some conversations with people who might be able to make some changes.
Yes.
So on that note, Milo, thank you very much for joining us again on the Growing Revolution
Thank you
podcast.
very much. Have a great day.